Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin daf lamed gimel. I will warn you, it's definitely not an easy daf today, and it might take a little bit longer because we're going to learn a lot about tumah v'tahara, and we need a lot of background to be able to understand what's going on in the daf. So that's the first warning for today. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is go back to what we had yesterday. I'll just do a very quick review of where we're up to. We had a Mishnah that talked about some cases. Shechita tavesh, pasakar ger, shechita tavesh. Right? And that second case created a problem because it's listed in the Mishnah in the next chapter as a treifa, and this Mishnah called it a nevela. And we said, how could that be? So we had a bunch of different answers to this question. And answer number 3, we got off on a tangent. We got off on a tangent from answer number 3, which was Reish Lakish's position, where he basically talked about, forgetting now about in the context of the sugya, but he basically talked about this idea that when you cut the windpipe, it takes out the functionality of the lung, which means that if you then get a perforation in the lung, it doesn't matter. If you've already cut the windpipe before you cut the gullet, it doesn't make a difference now that you have a hole in the lung, because the lung is as if it was kind of taken out of the body already. Okay, now we're off on a tangent about that statement he made. So the first thing we said was that Rava said, only the windpipe connected to the lung, not to the innards, because the windpipe doesn't lead to the innards and therefore there's no effect. So if you cut the windpipe and you haven't cut the gullet yet and you end up with a hole in the innards, well, it doesn't matter. In other words, you're going to trafe up that animal. It's going to be a problem. We don't view it as if the innards were taken out. Rabbi Zeira said, what's the difference? Innards, what's the difference? Lungs. You start taking out the life of the animal starts to fall apart. So who really cares if you get a hole in the innards? Because in general, it makes sense to just say, yeah, of course the animal's starting to go at that point, and it shouldn't make your animal a treifa. Then we said that Rabbi Zeira changed his mind about that. Okay, so let's start back from there. How do we know he changed his mind? Because of a question he asked. He asked the following question. Okay, at the bottom of Lamed Bet Amud Bet, Nikvu b'nei me'ayin bein siman siman mahu. What if you got a hole in the innards between one siman to the other, which is exactly our case? Mi mitzdaref siman rishon siman sheni l'tara midei nevela or lo. Can we view the cutting of the two simanim as one continuum? That it enabled this animal not to be considered, not considered an avela, but a treifa. Okay, now already there we actually have the point, because, okay, and we'll say it explicitly on the next page, but basically he's saying it's definitely forbidden to eat. It's just a matter of, do we call it a treifa and there's no impurity, or do we call it an avela and there is impurity? That's the question. The question is not, can you eat it or not? Of course you can't eat it. It seems pretty clear from what he said, which means he must have changed his mind. For whatever reason, which I'm not sure why, but they bring this other point about when he asked that question, kind of like they were just telling over. When he asked the question, it came along with Amrina, and they said to him, Lav hainud by Ilfa. Isn't your question just like what Ilfa asked about a different topic, but a similar situation where we have something that transpired between the first siman to the second siman, which is, okay, you have to know some background here, which is when you slaughter an animal that's pregnant, the fetus that's inside the baby, okay, whether it's a fetus or fully grown or whatever it is permitted to eat by the shechita of the mother. Okay, it's called a ben pekuah. You can just eat it. You can just stab it, take the life out of it, and eat it. Okay, now only though if it was a ubar and it was inside when the mother was slaughtered. So what if hotzi ubar et yado ben siman l'siman mahu? What if it put out its arm, which then wouldn't be covered by the shechita? But instead of putting it out before the shechita, the arm went out in between the siman rishon and siman sheni. So again, it's an issue of, right, do we view this? Now, here's the question. It's the same question they say as Rabbi Zeira asked, but again, that's totally irrelevant for the flow of our Gemara, just so you know. In other words, we don't need this for our purposes, but they brought it anyway, so we're going to learn it. Mi mitzaref siman rishon siman sheni l'tara midei nevela or lo. This yad that comes out is basically called an aver min hachai, because the animal's still alive when the hand came out, and then, even though the animal will be permitted to eat, you won't be able to eat the hand. It's called an aver min hachai. Aver min hachai usually has the tumah of a nevela. But since the yad was connected to the body, when the body was inside at the time, and the yad only came out in between the first siman and the second siman, do we say that we can view this as one shechita, which covers the yad to be, now not to eat, but to say, okay, it doesn't have tuma nevela to it, or no, because the yad already came out in the middle, and when we don't view it that way. Okay, so if something happens between the siman rishon and siman sheni, do we view this as like two different cuts and they don't necessarily combine, or do they? Okay, so they basically said the same question. Anyway, back to the line that I told you we'd get to, which is going back to Rabbi Zeira's question, ad kan lo violate ela l'tara midein nevela aval v'achila asura. Okay, till this point, right, he asked, is it tahor or tameh, but obviously treif or nevela, but ba'achila asura. But it was obvious to him that you can't eat those, right, that animal, because the innards, right, had a problem after the slaughtering of the kaneh, which goes against what he said, because mali re'ah, mali b'nei me'ayim, once the animal's already half slaughtered, we don't care what happens in terms of, a hole in the innards. But now we have a dissenting opinion. Maybe it's not so clear from here that Rabbi Zeira changed his mind. Why? Amalei Rav Acha barav leRavina. So Rav Acha barav says to Ravina, Dilma lo olam lo hadarbe. Maybe he really didn't change his mind. How do you explain this question that he asked? Rabbi Zeira, lidvarav de Rava ka'amar v'le lo svira le. Maybe he was just saying, according to Rava's explanation, that we're going to differentiate between the b'nei me'ayim and the lung, right, the innards and the lung. Would he say, though, that if it happened in between, maybe, though, it still wouldn't be a treif, it wouldn't be a nevela, okay? And he was asking only according to Rava. He thinks, no matter what, of course, you can even eat it. Forget about it, it's not a nevela. You can eat it, but he was asking according to Rava, would he make this distinction if that were to happen? Okay, so maybe he didn't change his mind. Second point about Reish Lakish, and we're going to get into a very interesting sugya. It's a topic of Gefer for this week, but we haven't even gotten in Hebrew yet, and then it needs to be translated to English, so I'm not sure when it's going to go up, but hopefully, Be'ezras Hashem, it will go up, and I'm sure it will be a worthwhile shiur to listen to about something really interesting. We're going to see here that perhaps laws for non-Jews may be more strict than laws for Jews in certain instances. Okay, a very interesting issue, which comes up from Reish Lakish. Okay, you're wondering how? We're going to see right now. Amar Rav Acha bar Yaakov, Shma mina mid Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. From Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish's words, this distinction that once you cut the kaneh, it takes out the life of the lung, and anything that happens to the lung after, right? It's as if, let's just go the main important point that's going to be relevant here. It's as if the lung is sitting in a basket outside the animal's body. Okay, as soon as you sever the windpipe, which gives life to the lung, we view the lung as if it's outside the body. So, from Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, you get to this fascinating halacha. Mizamnim Yisrael b'nei me'ayim. Okay, if you want to serve the innards of your animal, which most commentaries think we're talking about the heart, the lung, the stomach, okay, all the inner pieces, the kishkas, So if you want to serve those parts of the animal, you can invite all your Jewish friends, but guess what? Ein mizamnim ovdei kochavim b'nei me'ayim. You can't serve this meat to non-Jews. Why? Because, okay, without understanding yet why, but because it's lifnei iver lo titei michshol. You're putting a stumbling block before someone, you're causing them to sin. Basically, it means they're not kosher for them. Okay, fascinating. The food is going to be kosher for Jews, not for non-Jews. So, my taima, Yisrael de b'shchita talya milta. Okay, for Jews, what's the way? Now, here's the big difference, right? Non-Jews don't have to slaughter animals. Jews have to slaughter, but because we have to slaughter, it's all dependent on the slaughter. What does that mean? As soon as you cut the windpipe and the gullet, at that point, the animal is pronounced dead, even if the animal's still alive. Okay, the animal could still technically be alive, convulsing, but it's pronounced dead. Okay? And therefore, you can eat, kevan de eat ka shechita ma'aliyata ishtere lehu. Okay, this has nothing to do yet with Reish Lakish. This just has to do with the laws of shechita. Because we have laws of shechita, that actually creates a leniency. It means as soon as the two simanim are cut, you're good to go. Meat is kosher immediately, even if the animal still has some signs of life in it. Ovdei kochavim de benechira sage lehu. Now, ovdei kochavim, non-Jews, it's enough to just stab the animal. They don't have shechita as a rule, right? They can just stab the animal. Some people even go far as to say they have to do it with stabbing. They can't do shechita, okay, which is an interesting opinion, but most think, okay, you can do it in any way. So then what determines moment of death? It's not the cutting of the two simanim, it's b'mita tal yamilta. It's when the animal actually dies. So they have to wait for a later stage. Okay, so fine. So they wait. What's the big deal? No, but now, if we view, now here you get it, if the kaneh is connected to the re'ah, and you assume the veshet, which is where the food goes down, is connected to the stomach, right, and the innards, then when you cut the windpipe and the gullet, okay, it's as if all those inner parts are sitting outside the body. And if you're a non-Jew and the animal's still alive, then if we view those parts as outside the body, then they're called iver min hachai. And iver min hachai is one of the Noachide laws. So hane ke iver min hachai damu, they're like iver min hachai, and the non-Jews can't eat them. So if you're having a big meal and you're serving those parts of the meat, don't invite your non-Jewish friends to the dinner, okay? You're basically causing them to sin. That's a really interesting line. So Amar Rav Papa, Haviyativna Kamed Rav Acha bar Yaakov. So Rav Papa says, I got in front of this rabbi who said this statement, and by the Emale, I really wanted to say to him, Mi ikamidi de l'Yisrael share ulove kochavim asur. How could it be that to us it's permitted, and to non-Jews it's forbidden? Right? How could that possibly be? This, by the way, comes up with the sugya of Iver min hachai in Sanhedrin on Daf Nun Chet Amud Bet. It has this line, right? The things that are permitted to Jews, of course, they're going to be permitted to non-Jews, right? And they have a question. How could it be that we're going to have some stringency for non-Jews that doesn't exist for Jews, right? That sounds absurd, okay? Because again, remember, why can we eat them? Because we have laws of shechita. That basically means that we can eat them because as soon as the animal, the windpipe and the gullet are severed, the meat is kosher, okay? Even if the animal's still convulsing. It's specifically for the Gentiles that they don't have that law, so they have to wait till the animal's actually dead. And again, this is all according to Reish Lakish's understanding. If we view those pieces as if they're outside, then they're basically iver min hachai, okay? And that's, again, stage 1 is cut the windpipe. Stage 2, cut the gullet. Or I don't know if you have to do it in that order, but let's just say, cut the windpipe, cut the gullet, immediately, right? The lungs, the innards, they're all considered disconnected from the body, but the animal's still convulsing. For Jews, the second you cut the windpipe, it's fine. Because, right, once you cut the windpipe and the gullet, the animal's immediately kosher. So we don't call this iver min hachai. For the non-Jew, it's not yet dead. So it's not kosher. Because those inner pieces, right, the rest of the meat will eventually be kosher. But the inner pieces, the innards and all that, are basically as if they were separated and you can't eat them. Okay, so now the non-Jews can't eat them. So basically, Rav Papa says this is absurd. There's no way that there's things that we can eat and they can't eat. Doesn't make any sense. And I really, really wanted to say that to Rav Acha. Below Amrile, but I held back. I didn't say it. Why not? Damina hatama kamar. I said, look, he has a reason. In other words, he gave his explanation based on what Reish Lakish said. And that logic must, I guess he says, overrides this issue of how could there be something that Jews can eat and non-Jews can't. But Tanya de Loka Rav Acha bar Yaakov. But now we're going to bring a braita that goes against what Rav Acha bar Yaakov says. And here we go. If you want to eat from an animal, take some of the meat before the life leaves the animal. What you do is, excuse me. Now the hide needs to be taken off, but if you go right where the neck is, there's no hide there because you already cut. So go inside the neck where the beta shechita is, where you did the slaughtering. Well, you have to salt it really well because there's a lot of blood there. Rinse it really well because you got to get out all the blood. That's the place where there's the most blood. And then you wait till the body. Like you still have to wait till really the life comes out of the animal, but then you can already eat that. Now here it says both the Jew and a non-Jew can eat this. So what do you see? If you took this part of the meat off before the animal was dead, even the non-Jew can eat it. So that seems to go against what Rav Acha said. And Misayel, the Rabbi Bar Avin, this braita that we just brought, supports this statement that Rabbi Bar Avin said, which is also along the same lines. The Amar Rabbi Bar Avin, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Ashyan, if you want to get healthier, this is like healthy tips of what to eat. Okay, right? We do this all the time now. Everybody's always searching the internet. What are the healthy things to eat? The rabbis also had a lot of health advice. We haven't had this in a while, but we get some health advice. If you want to eat something healthy that will help you either if you're sick, get better, or maybe just healthy food. Cut the meat exactly where the slaughter was. Make sure is exactly the same thing. Salt it really well, rinse it really well. Wait till the animal dies, and then Jews and non-Jews alike are allowed to eat this. So you see here that there seems to be this other opinion. Maybe not everyone held by Reish Lakish, and maybe that's why, or they just didn't think it applies here. They just thought that this principle overrides that there's no way that we can do things that non-Jews can't. Must be they're allowed to eat it. Okay, with that we finish sugya number 1. Now we get to the more, I'd say both these sugyas are a little complicated, but the second sugya is going to be complicated because we have to know all sorts of laws of purity and impurity. So let's start with, and Alana Steinhan's shir this week, which also hasn't come in, so I haven't listened yet, but it's a fascinating topic. It's called washing for bread as an acknowledgement of human fallibility. Okay, so this is like an interesting topic. Why do we wash hands? Okay, so the rabbis decreed that all hands are shniot. Okay, let's talk about levels of impurity. We have to understand first degree, second degree, third degree, fourth degree. Okay, we have an avatuma. Okay, we have the actual item itself that's tamei, an avatuma. Let's just go with a sheretz. It's an easy example. You have a creepy crawler. It can pass on impurity, a dead one. Okay, pass on impurity to create rishons. Okay, now it can pass on impurity to Adam, people, and kelim, vessels, and food and drink. The next level of impurity, which is second degree, is that that person, vessel, or food comes in contact with food or drink. It can only pass on impurity or rishon to food and drink, creates second level impurity. That's sheni l'tuma. Now, usually that's the end game. If you're talking about the world of Chullin, there is no shlishi l'tuma in Chullin, although that's going to be our big question today, okay? But generally, there's no shlishi l'tuma. If that food that was a sheni or drink comes in contact with truma or kachim, then we go down to level 3, okay? It creates third level degree impurity in both truma and kachim, and fourth degree impurity only exists by kachim, which are sacrificial items. So generally, we'll say a sheni is poselet truma, disqualifies it, because it's called disqualifying because that's the end game. It's ruined. It has to be burned, truma, that becomes impure. And since there's no revi'i, so we say it's posel because that's the end. In kachim, it goes to third level and then to fourth level. So it's mitame degree, a third degree in kachim and sacrificial items, and that can even go to a fourth level. Okay, that's number 1 basic thing you need to know. Yeah, I talked about Alana talked about washing hands. Why do we wash our hands? Okay, we wash our hands. It's called because of strach truma. Okay, what does that mean? Well, in the time of the temple, the rabbis decreed in general that hands touch a lot of things. Okay, that's why I assume she talked about the human fallibility. We touch a lot of things, we don't pay attention. And we might come in contact all the time with impure things. So the rabbis decreed that everybody's hands are shniot. Okay, they're second degree impurity. Now, what would that mean? Well, it means I could touch any chullin. I don't have to worry about it, right? So why do we wash our hands before we eat? Okay, again, we don't have impurity anyway, but we're doing this as a remembrance of what was. But the Kohanim had to do it for truma purposes, okay? Because if they would eat truma, they had to make sure their hands were clean. So they always had to wash their hands, right? Generally, if you think about it, to purify ourselves, we go in the mikvah, our whole body. But the rabbis basically said your hands are tamei, and therefore you can just rinse off your hands, and that's enough, right? Do the netilat yadayim. So that takes off the impurity in your hands. But that's only going to be relevant for truma, okay? We do it to remember that, okay? And in case, they kohanim in general, often, and we're going to get to this concept, ate their items. So this is a really important introduction because we're going to come back to all these concepts today. Ate their chullin. There were groups of kohanim, you could even call them maybe sects of kohanim, who would eat everything as if they're truma. And that means that if now I said, yadayim don't make chullin, right? They don't pass on impurity to chullin. But if you treat all your chullin like kachim, this is a fascinating concept, your impurity can pass on to chullin also. Because you're treating all your chullin as if they're kachim, as if they're truma. So there's people who did that with truma, and there's people who did it with kodshim, meaning there's people who, not with truma, there's people who treated their items as truma, so third degree impurity would go, would be passed down. And then there were people who even treated their stuff as if it was kodesh. That's called Chullin al ta'arata kodesh. They ate their Chullin as if they were kodshim. So that would even go to fourth degree impurity. Okay, but those were just people who were a little bit, you could call them crazy, or not crazy, but, treated this very, very seriously. Okay? And then what's fascinating is if you do that, then it seems like that impurity could actually pass. Right? The rabbi said, okay, if you're going to treat it like that, from a rabbinic level, the impurity is going to pass to third, to fourth, etc. Well, just that. Okay, that's a lot of background. Let's try to learn our sugya and let's see how this all connects. So the Mishnah says, "Hashochet behema chaya ve'of, v'lo yatsa mehem dam." Now we get to one other issue about impurity that's important that we've seen a lot, so not as new. Susceptibility to impurity. In order for something, let's take crops, in order for fruits, produce, all that to become impure, first it has to be cut from the ground. Then once it's detached, it has to have one of the 7 liquids come upon it, okay, one of them being blood. Okay, well, blood is one of the 7 liquids. Until then, it's not ready for eating, okay? Right, like imagine you take a potato from the ground, you go to a farm, you pick a potato, right? If you don't wash that potato, it's disgusting. No one's going to eat it like that. So without washing it, this produce is not ready yet. Now, let's take a different example. You have a vessel. A vessel, when does it become susceptible to impurity? Not when a liquid gets upon it, but when you finish making it, when it's a final product. So what about meat? Okay, the machloket in the Mishnah is, do you need a liquid to get upon it? Which in this case, the easiest liquid would be blood, because while you're slaughtering the animal, the blood gets on the meat, and then it creates susceptibility to impurity. So comes the Mishnah and says, Tanakama says, "Hashochet behema chaya ve'of, v'lo yatsa mehem dam." What if for some reason there was no blood? Kshirim, okay, the meat's kosher. You don't have to have blood come out to make the meat kosher. V'nechalim biyadayim esavot, and it can be eaten with dirty hands. Dirty means impure hands, meaning it's not susceptible to impurity. So we don't care if you touch it with your impure hands because no blood got on it. Okay, the obvious inference, which is the first thing the Gemara is going to say, is if the blood got on it, though, you can't eat this with impure hands because it's going to contract impurity. Okay, we'll get back to that. That's going to be our big problem, that line. Okay, but anyway, the Mishnah continues to say, "Lafisha lo huchsharu b'dam," because there was no blood, so it didn't become susceptible to impurity. Rabbi Shimon completely disagrees. Rabbi Shimon omer, huchsharu b'shechita. What do you mean? Just like a vessel becomes a vessel when it turns into a finished item, this meat that a minute ago couldn't be eaten because it was, what you would call, if you would cut the meat, it would be ever min hachai, back to ever min hachai, okay, like a limb from a live animal. But now that you slaughtered it, it's now kosher. That's enough to basically say it went from uselessness to useful. And you don't need water to get upon it, okay? It's liquid, blood. It's fine. It's already susceptible to impurity, which means you can't eat it with your hands being impure because you'll pass on impurity to the meat, okay? And that's where the Gemara starts. The Gemara says, okay, we're not really so concerned right now with this big machloket. Okay, we're going to put Rabbi Shimon's position aside. We're going to go back to Tanakama. Now, Tanakama says, Tama, the reason for Tanakama is Delo yatsa mehem dam, because no blood came out. Ha yatsa mehem dam, but it seems pretty clear from the Mishnah. If blood did come out, it would be susceptible to impurity, and because it says no blood, you can eat it with your hands that are impure. Ein nechalim biyadayim esavot, but if blood came out, you can't eat it with your hands that are impure. But amai, now let's go back to what I told you. If you didn't figure out the problem, here's the problem. Yadayim shniot hein. Okay, the rabbis decree that our hands are second degree impurity, which means ein sheni ose shlishi b'chulin. Aren't we talking about Chullin here? We're in Masechet Chullin. Aren't we talking about Chullin? We're not talking about sacrificial meat here. We're talking about regular meat. There's no third degree impurity. It doesn't even pass on third degree impurity to Chullin. So what are you talking about? So the first thing before we start to get to our answers is, how do you know we're talking about Chullin? Okay, maybe we're not. Maybe we're talking about kodshim. We already had some Mishnayot where they said, oh, that one's talking about kodshim, right? Even the first Mishnah, remember, we differentiate. That line's about kodshim, this is about Chullin. Okay, so maybe we're talking about Chullin. So now they're going to prove, kodshim. And in kodshim, obviously, we'd have an issue. So we're going to have 4 answers to prove, 4 ways to prove that we're not talking about kodshim. Okay, and then we're going to go back and try to answer the question. So first of all, how do we know we're talking about Chullin? Number one, the katani chaya. There are no chayot. What does our Mishnah say? Hashochet behema chaya v'ov. Now behema and ov could be korbanot. A chaya, there's no korbanot that come from a chaya. So number one, they're talking about chayot, and chayot are in korbanot. V'tu, iba kadashim, ki lo yatsa mehem dam kshera, hu atzmo lidam utzarich. How could you say it's kshera if no blood came out? A korban needs blood, right? That's if you're to learn something in Zvachim, it's the blood is the main part of the korban. So there's no such thing as an animal you started for a korban that doesn't have any blood come out. If it doesn't have any blood come out, you can't bring it as a korban. It can't be a kosher korban. You can't sprinkle the blood. So number two reason. Number three, v'tu, and furthermore, iba kodashim ketzam behem dam mimachshir. The blood of a sacrifice cannot create susceptibility to impurity. Okay, you're wondering why we differentiate between different kinds of blood. Well, how do we know? Okay, the laws of susceptibility to impurity come up in the Torah. It says when you put water on seeds. So water is the liquid. How do we get the blood is going to be also a liquid? Well, Hama Rabbi Zeira bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, didn't he say, Minayin l'dam kodashim sheino machshir? How do you know that the blood of a sacrifice doesn't create susceptibility to impurity, which means obviously then our mission is irrelevant, right? It's not talking about kodshim. Shneamar al aretz tishbachenu kemayim. There's a pasuk that compares blood to water. It's talking about don't eat the blood, and when it says don't eat the blood, it says you should spill it on the ground when you're sacrificing animals, it said spill the blood, okay? Meaning don't eat it or anything else, but spill the blood like water. Now, what does it talk about there? It compares blood to water. Water gets spilled on the ground, right, and goes to waste. Also the blood. So the blood that gets spilled, okay, dam shenishpach kamayim machshil. So what kind of blood is like water? The one that gets spilled on the ground. Now we see why dam kodashim doesn't work because we don't spill it on the ground. Sheino nishpach kamayim eno machshil. If it doesn't get spilled because you collect it and you put it on the altar, then that's not blood that's going to create susceptibility to impurity, which means obviously our mission is not talking about kodshim. Fourth answer, v'tu iba kodashim ki lo yatsa. Now, what's the whole premise of the Mishnah? If there's no blood, it won't become susceptible to impurity. But wait, kosher is susceptible to impurity without blood, without any liquid. How do we know this? Because we learned this once before. Litkashru b'chibat hakodesh. What makes it significant? Even if you think that meat isn't significant enough on its own and needs blood or a liquid to get upon it to create the susceptibility, not in sacrifices. Because sacrifices have a unique significance because they're sacrifices. The fact that chibat hakodesh, that the love of kodshim, right, this importance of kodshim, of sacrificial items, already gives it the kaimalan chibat hakodesh mechashartan. Okay, it's known. It's a known thing that things that were meant for sacrifices don't need susceptibility and impurity to make them susceptible and as a liquid because they have a different thing. Again, it's all about, if we go back to the kli, the vessel, it's once it becomes useful. Well, this has a use, a very important use, because it's used in a sacrifice. Because of that, it doesn't need susceptibility. So, 4 reasons why this mission is not talking about kodshim, which gets us back to our question. If it's not talking about kodshim, then, right, what's it talking? Then how? If it's talking about Chullin and your hands are dirty, right, meaning impure, how can it pass on impurity? In Chullin, there is no shlishi. So, first answer. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Acha. Hacha b'Chullin shelekacham b'kesef maaser askinan. Maybe we're talking about Chullin that were bought with your Maser Sheni money. Now, Maser Sheni is produce, okay? So it can't be talking about that. But when you redeem it onto a coin and bring it to Jerusalem, you're allowed to buy with it either produce or you can buy meat. So maybe you bought meat with it, okay? Now, if it has sanctity of Maser Sheni, maybe Shlishi passes on to Maser Sheni. And they're going to say, De lo ki Rabbi Meir. Well, this is not like Rabbi Meir. It's like the opinion of the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Meir. And we're going to see this right now. It's not. I'm going to see in the Mishnah, turning now to Amabet. Kol hata'un bi'at mayim midivrei sofrim. This is anything that needs to be washed in water by rabbinic law. This could be either, it has to be toveled in the mikvah, or like your hands, which is what we've been discussing, which have to be, you do netilat yadayim, washing your hands. Anything that the rabbis decreed is going to be impure. Mitameh, okay, which is second degree impurity normally. Mitameh takodesh uposel tatruma. Now this is what I told you, right? What does it do? It creates impurity in kodshim because it makes them a third degree, which can then be passed on to a fourth degree. And posel tatruma disqualifies truma because truma at third degree impurity becomes disqualified. Umutar b'chulin u'b'maser, divrei Rabbi Meir. Basically what this is saying is a sheni, certainly by a rabbinic sheni, but even in Torah law also, but rabbinic sheni, right, the second degree impurity that was decreed by the rabbis, is completely permitted to touch chulin and maser. Okay, so you can eat chulin, you can eat maser, it's no problem. Divrei Rabbi Meir. So that definitely doesn't fit with what we just said. That's why we said it's not like Rabbi Meir. Chachamim osrim b'maaser. But the rabbis forbid in maaser. They say, now forbid what? Okay, it's a little bit of a strange language, but what they're going to say is if your hands are shniot, don't touch maaser because it's going to create third degree impurity in maaser. It's a little bit strange, the language of osrim, and we'll get back to that in a minute. But right now they're assuming what it means is it can pass on impurity of third degree, and that's exactly what they're saying, right? It can't be eaten with third degree impurity, with your hands dirty, if the blood got on it, if it was meat that was bought from maaser sheni money. Okay? And then the Mishnah is only a case of maaser sheni. And only according to the rabbis, not according to Rabbi Meir. But matkefla Rav Shimi Barashi. Rav Shimi Barashi says, Mimai. Why are you explaining the machloket that way? Dilma agkan lo pligi Rabbanan alei to Rabbi Meir ela ba'achilat maaser. Maybe it's only talking about eating maaser that you can't do. Ava b'negia de maaser v'achila de chulin lo pligi. But maybe they don't think that by touching maaser sheni meat, you're going to pass on third degree impurity to maaser. Maybe they're just saying, if your hands are impure, don't eat maaser sheni stuff. But not that don't touch it. Like osrim sounds more like you can't eat it. Okay? Not you can't, right? It's going to become impure. Okay, so it becomes impure, right? It's not like there's something wrong with making it impure. Truma, it's a problem to make it impure because you'll have to burn it and you've ruined truma. But maaser sheni, it's not like it's usser. That would be mitame b'maaser, something like that. So, okay, now, v'ha nigiyahi. Now, our Mishnah is talking about nigiyah. How do you know that? Now, doesn't it say you can eat it with yadayim mesuavot, right? Which means, again, if it got blood on it, you can't eat it. But look what it says. It doesn't say ve'ochelim b'yadayim mesuavot. It says ne'echalim. Ne'echalim is passive. So they say our Mishnah is clearly talking about touching and how you can touch it. It won't pass on impurity if you touch it, but it will if it already became susceptible to impurity. Now, how do we know that? Because it says mitakatani ne'echalim b'yadayim mesuavot. Milo askina ne'esim. What does it mean ne'echalim? Passive. It means de kasafe lechavre. It means that if my hands are impure, then what? Again, we're going to go with the inference. I don't have to tell you what the Mishnah says. We know I could do it with yadayim mesuavot. But if the blood got on it first, it created susceptibility to impurity, I wouldn't be able to touch it with my hands and feed you. Okay? It's not the issue of eating. The focus is on, can I touch it? And maybe the machloket Rabbi Meir and the rabbis isn't about touching, and nobody thinks touching would pass on third degree impurity to maaser. In which case, this answer is out. Second answer. Ela amar Rav Papa. Hacha biyadayim tchilot askinan udi Rabbi Shimon ben Elazarhi. Again, each time we're going to say it's one side of a two-sided machloket. But Papa says maybe we're talking about a case, which we're going to have to see what the case is, where the rabbis decree that your hands are going to be a rishon. And then that would resolve everything, because rishon passes on impurity to a sheni, and there's sheni by chullin. And then we'd be good. Okay? Now, we're going to have to see what the case is in a minute, but and now it only works with Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, as we're going to see in this machloket. Tanya, you have to do two things. Number one is say, which is going to be number two here, what is yadayim rishon? When are they rishon? The second thing you have to say is, does a rishon, when the rabbis decreed, now obviously rishon passes on second degree impurity to chullin, but when the rabbis decree that your hands are going to be a rishon, okay, remember, they decreed everyone's hands are sheni, but in unique circumstances they deem people's hands rishon, and then if you touch something that's a sheni, you're going to ruin it. Was that law only for kodshim and truma, that it basically you can create second degree impurity in truma, which can pass on to third degree, and kodshim's the same? Or was it also for chullin? That's going to be the machlok of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar and the rabbis. And obviously we're looking for the one who says it does pass on to chullin. Okay, so let's see. Tanya. Ein yadayim tchilot lechulin. So first we get to the rabbis who this wouldn't fit with. When the rabbi, ein yadayim tchilot lechulin means when the rabbis decreed that hands could be rishon, not that it could create a sheni, a second level degree impurity in a chullin. if I touch Chullin when my hands are rishons by rabbinic decree, right? The rabbi said my hands are rishon now because of what I did. We'll see in a minute what it is. But if I touch Chullin, nothing's going to happen because this Gzeira de Rabbanan, this ordinance of the rabbis of rishon, my hands being a rishon, is only to pass on to truma or kodshin, okay, but not to Chullin. But Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer Mishum Rabbi Meir Yadayim Tchilot LeChullin Ushniot LeTruma. Okay, my hands, when the rabbis decreed that they're a rishon for Chullin, and they're a sheni for regarding truma. Okay, that's a weird statement. So, okay, but the main point right now is that they're a rishon for Chullin. And then that would fit perfectly with our Mishnah. We must be talking about a case where the rabbis decree rishon, and according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, that when hands are a rishon by rabbinic ordinance, it even messes up Chullin. And that's what our Mishnah is talking about. Before we talk about the issues here, we're going to say, wait, tchilot lechulin in the truma lo. Wait, how could you possibly say they're a rishon regarding chulin and they're a sheni regarding truma? That's very weird. We're going to be more lenient on truma than on chulin. So they say no. Hachi kamen. This is how you read it. Tchilot af lechulin. They're a rishon even for chulin. And shniot, but when the rabbis decreed your hands are going to be a sheni, which is what we've been talking about all along, l'truma in l'chulin lo. That's only going to be for truma purposes, not for chulin. Okay, so we dealt with the side issue. Okay, the main point though is that we're back to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, our Mishnah fits with him, that you can pass on this impurity, this rishon impurity, to chulin. Okay, so now they want to say, wait, umi kayadayim tchilot, wait, is there a case where the rabbis decreed that your hands are going to be a rishon? What are you talking about? Say, in fact there is. Detaches, as it says in a Braita. Hichnis yadav lebayit menuga. Anything that's in a bayit menuga becomes impure. Okay, this is a leprous house. All the vessels, if you remember, before the Kohen declares it, they say take everything out of the house to save the people's property. Because until the Kohen declares it, it's not actually leprous. But that's a side point. If I walk into a bayit menuga, I become impure. Okay, this leprous house. What if I just put in my hand? Okay, now it says whatever comes into the house. Now, the hand going into the house isn't really my body, so I don't become impure yet. But, hichnis yadav l'bayim menuga yadav tchilot. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says the rabbis decreed my hands are going to be a rishon. That's what we were looking for. Chachamim amrim yadav shniot. The rabbis actually disagree. So now this is only going to work according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar and according to Rabbi Akiva that there is such a thing as yadayim rishon. Okay, Chaim say your hands are actually only a sheni. Okay, they are impure, but they're a sheni. Okay, which again then wouldn't be relevant here because there's no shlishi for chulin. Now, what's the machloket between them? Again, we're going off our issue a little bit just to understand the machloket. Dekulei alma bia b'miktzat lo shma bia. Everybody thinks this is not actually coming into the house because it's just a part of your body, just your arm. That's it's not considered that you're really impure. But they disagree about this gzeira that the rabbis instituted. We're going to be gozer on your hands just in case, right, you make a mistake and think if my body comes in, I won't be impure, right? So we'll say your hand is impure to make you realize that your body by Torah law is going to be impure. So now the machloket is though, mar savar yadav kegufo shavina rabbanan. So Rabbi Akiva says, look, since it's all about your body, right? And if you walk in, you're going to be a rishon. So when the rabbis made the gzeira on the hand, they made it exactly the same as the body. Rishon. Mar Savar, the rabbi said, no, yadayim k'yadayim da'alma shavinu rabbanan. No, we're going to say your hands are impure by rabbinic degree, but we're going to make it the way all the rabbinic degrees on hands are. Hands are shniot. That's just the way it is. They're second degree impurity, so we're going to say your hands are shniot. Okay, that's the machloket. Okay, but anyway, the point being that the Mishnah could match Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, who says, we're talking about a case where the rabbi decreed your hands will be a rishon, like in the Bayit Menuga. Now, the Gemara says, if we're already here, v'look like Rabbi Akiva damar yadav tchilot havyan. Why don't we just say, why go with Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar? Just go with Rabbi Akiva. Now, why is that better? Well, first of all, Stam Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Meir was a student of Rabbi Akiva. So it would make more sense to stick the Mishnah as Rabbi Akiva's opinion, and Rabbi Akiva says there's a case where your hands become a rishon. So why don't we just say the Mishnah matches Rabbi Akiva? Okay, but the obvious answer is, since we already saw there was a machloka between Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar and the rabbis, that if your hands are rishon, can they be matami chulin or only truma and kodshim? So we don't know where Rabbi Akiva holds in that debate. So that's why we didn't say Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva just says there is such a thing as rishon, but he doesn't say can it pass on impurity to chulin. So, Dilma Kika Amar Rabbi Akiva, maybe when Rabbi Akiva said it, maybe he was saying we're going to consider your hands rishon, that if they touch truma or kachim, it's going to turn them into a sheni. Okay? But maybe when it relates to chulin, maybe your hands will only be shniot, and then they don't do anything for chulin. V'lihavya nami shniot. Okay, but now we have a further question, which is maybe we could say the Mishas Rabbi Akiva, and even if he says your hands are shniot, okay, now I'm going to undo something I told you before, which I said is a given. To Rabbi Akiva, it's not a given, okay? This would change everything, and this would be a really easy explanation for the Mishnah. Why don't we just say they're shniot? Dahasham ina leila Rabbi Akiva. We have a tradition that Rabbi Akiva says, Dama, sheni ose shlishi b'chulin. He thinks there is shlishi b'chulin. So that's easy. Say our Mishas Rabbi Akiva, and it's a sheni, which is what we thought. Yadayim or shenis. And if the blood had gotten on there, it would pass on impurity to chulin, because Rabbi Akiva thinks you could pass on third-degree impurity to chulin. How do we know that Rabbi Akiva holds this? Ditnan, because it says in the Mishnah. Bo bayom, on that day, this is the day they were made a Zeira on all this tum and tara stuff. Darash Rabbi Akiva. V'chol kli cheres yitma. Okay, now, during the whole pasuk, it's any kli cheres that yipol mehem el tocho, that falls into it, okay, kol asher, the sheretz, kol asher b'tocho yitma. Everything in there, okay, what happens? The sheretz, this is a good way to get your tum and tara. Sheretz falls into a vessel, okay? This is a klei cheres, so the airspace. I'm not going to get into all that right now, but falls into the vessel. The vessel becomes rishon, because the sheretz is an av. Vessel becomes a rishon. The food in the vessel becomes a sheni. Now, what does it say about the food? Yitma, will become impure. Now, it should just say tameh. It is impure. Why does it say yitma? Yitma implies there's a continuation after that, meaning it could pass on to something else. So he says, yitma tameh lo ne'amar ele yitma letameh achirim. What do we learn from this? Limed al kikar sheni, food, right? A loaf of bread that's a sheni. Shu oseh shlishi b'chulin. There you have it. That's Rabbi Akiva. So why don't we just explain the Mishnah according to him? So the answer, Dilma hanimile betuma deoraita avabadura. Bottom low. You can't compare the sheretz in a kli cheres to the hands that are shniot. Okay, in other words, you can't compare the loaf that got impure because it was in the vessel that got impure from the sheretz. That's all Torah law. In Torah Tuma, by Torah law, you maybe say, okay, Rabbi Akiva says there's a shlishi. Doesn't mean he's going to say when the rabbis decreed that all our hands maybe touch something and we're going to just say all hands are shenis, that's not going to be able to pass on impurity to a shlishi, even according to Rabbi Akiva, because that's just rabbinic tuma. We're going to be much more lenient with rabbinic tuma, so he wouldn't necessarily say it, and that's why we can't explain the Mishnah that way. Okay, so far we've had two explanations. This is sort of a third attempt to explain our Mishnah, because maybe you could just say it's Rabbi Akiva. Okay, I'll just review right now. First is chulin that you bought for Maser Sheni money, and not like Rabbi Meir. In the end, we said, no, maybe that just means you can't eat Maser Sheni if you're Tameh, but not that it actually becomes impure. Then we said Yadayim are Rishon, and according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, that's a possibility, okay? And then we explained that possibility according to Rabbi Akiva, and then within that second one, we kind of said, so that's why I don't know if you really count it as another one, but maybe the Mishnah is Rabbi Akiva, which we had two attempts within Rabbi Akiva, but in the end, we can't really do that. So now we get to our third answer. Okay? Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Oshaya. Hacha bechulin shenasua tarata kodesh askinan udelo keRabbi Yoshua. Maybe it's a case of chulin that someone treated, I'm going back now, as kodesh, okay? As sacrificial, not as chulin, as kodesh. Okay? Now, what we're saying is, maybe it's, now, remember what I said. If you treat it, then it will pass on to it, right? Tuma doesn't usually go to chulin, but what's fascinating about it is if you decide that it's going to be chulin, that your chulin is going to be like kodesh, you can pass on impurity, third level, fourth level, okay? So maybe that's the Mishnah. That would be the most intuitive, or maybe to say truma. Okay, we're going to differentiate. Maybe read it like truma. But they're going to say, right now they say, chulin shnasu al tarata kodesh skinan, udelo keRabbi Yoshua. Not like Rabbi Yoshua, though. Again, not like someone, okay? We had not like Rabbi Meir, then we had like Rabbi Shimon and Elazar, and here we have not like Rabbi Yoshua. They're always pointing out whether yes like or not like the unique opinion, not the standard, right? The rabbi's opinion, which is the unnamed opinion. So now, Ditanya. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, in this case, it's actually Rabbi Eliezer. You should have just said like Rabbi Eliezer, okay? Instead of saying not like Rabbi Yoshua, but whatever reason they said it like that. Ha'ochel ochel rishon, rishon. Okay, I like to say this, you are what you eat. Okay, you eat a rishon, you eat food that was a rishon, you become a rishon. You eat a sheni, hauchel, sheni. You eat a shlishi, you're a shlishi. Okay, you have the status of whatever it is you eat, which means you can pass on impurity in the way that whatever it is you ate could pass on impurity. Rabbi Yoshua Omer, hauchel ochel rishon, sheni. You never become a rishon from eating food, he says. If you eat a rishon or a sheni, you become a sheni. Shlishi, if you eat food that's a shlishi, it puts you up a level, okay? Sheni lekodesh, ve'en sheni letruma. So, you're going to be a sheni when it comes to kachim, but you're not going to be a sheni, okay, one second, what we say here, sheni lekodesh, but you're not going to be a sheni for truma. Okay, so if you eat a shlishi, there's no effect on truma, okay, but if you eat a sheni, you'll be a sheni for kodesh. Okay, so now, what food are we talking about here? Of Chullin are we discussing? Okay, because what Chullin is relevant here? Bechulin shenasu al taharat truma. Okay, what he says is, this is only Chullin that you treat al taharat truma, that you're going to be able to pass on impurity here. Okay, now, not truma kodesh. Al taharat truma in, al taharat kodesh lo. Okay, he's basically saying, you're not going to pass on impurity if you say you're doing it al taharat kodesh. Kasaval chulin shenasu al taharat kodesh leit behu shlishi. We're going to now say that Rabbi Yoshua thinks that if you treat it like taharat kodesh, it doesn't actually have any effect. Okay, the food doesn't become, there's no shlishi there. Okay, which means that our mission is not like him, because our mission is talking about someone who treats it like trumat kodesh, and not according to Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Eliezer thinks that you can pass it on to Truma. It actually does work. When I say I'm going to be super strict, I'm going to treat all my chulin as if it's Kodesh, it works, and the Truma passes down. Now, why is this? Why would Rabbi Yeshua make a distinction? He's going to say, this is all rabbinic. The rabbis, if I decide I'm going to treat my stuff as chulin or as Truma, as Kodesh or as Truma, whether it works or not is rabbinic. Okay, it's definitely not by Torah law. Now, in people who treated it like truma, that was very common. That was the Kohanim. In general, they did that because they wanted to make sure they didn't mess up their truma. Because it was common, the rabbis went along with it and said, okay, it's effective. Shlisha can pass on to chulin if you're treating it like truma. But Kodesh, very few people did that. It was a very rare kind of thing that people would treat it like Kodesh, because who eats kodshim all the time, right? Even the Kohanim don't eat kodshim all the time. So those people, right, the rabbi said that's not going to be effective according to Rabbi Yoshua. Okay, but anyway, the point for our purposes is, we're going to explain the Mishnah that it can pass on to chulin, because these were chulin that you treated as if they were kodshim. Okay, we're going to get back to this and continue with the sugya tomorrow. Right now, we're at the end for today, and because the obvious question is, why don't you just say it's al truma, right? Al tarata truma, and then that would be according to both of them. That would have been a much easier answer. Okay, so that's obviously the next line of the Gemara. So what do we have today? We have basically two sugyas. One was the Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, which we took to two places. One was Rabbi Zeira, and the way he understood, right, disagree with Rava, and did he change his mind or not, is just the lung windpipe connection, or would it be effective for also the innards? And then we got to this crazy thing that you can learn from Reish Lakish, that you basically what we can eat, there's things that non-Jews can't eat, and therefore don't invite them to your meal to eat that kind of food, because of lifnei iver, of putting a stumbling block in front of someone else and making them sin. Then we got to this Mishnah where we were really concerned with the inference. Okay, so first of all, we had a machloket in the Mishnah. Is the blood, right, do you need the blood to make it susceptible to impurity or not? Is the shechita itself just makes it automatically meat important, susceptible to impurity? But if we go with the first one, that you need the blood, it implies if you have blood, you couldn't touch the meat because it will make it impure. But if it's chulin, which we proved in 4 ways, it's definitely not kachim. If it's chulin, how could that possibly be? Either it was maser sheni, or it was yadayim were rishons. It was in that unique case of the bayit menuga, and again, each time according to one opinion, or it was chulin shenasu al tarata kodesh, and then we're going to have to see where we go with that one. Okay, with that, wishing everyone a good day. I know it was a hard daf and a long one. There's a lot to fill in of information to help you. Hopefully it's clear. Have a good day.